I'm Glenn Campbell. I call myself a demographic philosopher. I'm looking at life and trying to predict the future through the lens of demography, or the study of human populations. In this episode, I want to talk about all the things I don't know. That is, the things that demographics and macroeconomics can't tell us. And I'm going to illustrate this by pointing out some of the things that have happened over the past few years that I would have never predicted, that took me totally by surprise. Of course, I couldn't have predicted the pandemic. It wasn't on my radar until late January of 2020. I was predicting a black swan event of some kind, but I couldn't have known that it would be a pandemic. If I were an epidemiologist, however, I would have known very well that something like this would have happened. They've been warning us about it for years, but no one could have predicted the specifics of where and when. And demographics and macroeconomics are a lot like that. You can predict that bad things are going to happen, but you don't know when and how and under what circumstances. Epidemiology is a little different than the other two in that we're just waiting for some random mutation or the random jump of a virus from one species to another. The risk is always there, but it's more or less constant. It doesn't build up over time. In contrast with demographics and macroeconomics, where the risk does build up over time, it's like stretching a rubber band to its limits. The more you stretch it, the more likely it is to break, which is not the case with the pandemic. We know, for example, that there's going to be a worldwide pensions crisis in the developed world, and this is a natural result of there being too many old people demanding their retirement benefits and not enough middle-aged and younger workers paying into the system. I don't know what form the crisis will take when things come to a head, but you know there will be a day of reckoning, and maybe many decades of reckoning, because we're not prepared for so many old people. There's a saying in economics, anything that can't go on forever will eventually end. This is called Stein's law. From the economist Herbert Stein. What he actually said was, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Our current demographics and macroeconomics are filled with unsustainable systems that will have to stop sooner or later. For example, a government can't keep spending more money than it collects in taxes, printing new money to make up the difference. That's what's happening right now, and it's been happening for years. Although nothing really bad seems to be resulting from it at this moment, in June 2021, you know it will. There will be a day of reckoning. However, a counterpoint to Stein's law is something I call Keynes' curse, because it is often attributed to economist John Maynard Keynes, although there's no evidence he actually said it. Keynes' curse says that markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. In other words, unsustainabilities can go on for a very long time. Anyone who has tried to short the market or shorted Tesla stock lately has learned the hard way. You can know for a fact that a system will fail, but if you don't know when it will fail and in what order, that information is pretty much useless to you as an investor. So I can tell you with great confidence that the U.S. monetary system will fail, but I can't tell you when. There's a fairly limited range of ways the system will break. There can be a massive asset crash that wipes out everyone's investments. There can be hyperinflation, which leaves nominal asset values in place, but wipes out the value of the dollar. I can say with great confidence that middle-aged workers who think they have a solid retirement plan will find that it's not there when they arrive, either through inflation or an asset collapse. I can further predict that at some point in the future, the U.S. government will either disintegrate or be forced to live within its means, which in itself implies a lot of disintegration. All of these things are likely to happen sooner or later because anything that can't go on forever will end. I just don't know where or in what sequence or what the secondary damage will be. I only know that the ship will sink. The most serious failing of demographics and macroeconomics is that they can't predict human politics and human behavior. They may be able to predict when social tensions will be high, but they can't predict specifically how those tensions will be expressed. For example, the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany was a fairly predictable macroeconomic event. If a government keeps printing money without restraint, eventually that money will become worthless. You could have also predicted with great certainty that hyperinflation would lead to a lot of human misery and popular discontent. What no one could have predicted, at least specifically, was the rise of Adolf Hitler and where he would lead his country. While you can safely say that high economic tensions tend to lead to radical populist movements, you can't say what form they will take. To me, the great wake-up call for our economic tension was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. This was a pivotal event in my life, and maybe in yours, when I realized that my rational theories about the world didn't work anymore. You can quibble that he didn't really win the popular vote, but the fact remains that roughly half the country thought that electing an obvious charlatan was a good idea. The election of 2020 was another harrowing event that I would have never predicted. Even after 4 years of obvious incompetence, roughly half the U.S. population still wanted to re-elect him. That trauma of 2016 is what launched me into demographics and macroeconomics. But it also forced me to define the difference between what I know and don't know. I know that a massive economic collapse is coming, but I can't say how human politics and human psychology will react to that event. I suspect that human politics will eventually take over and become the main story. For example, from our perspective today, the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany almost seems like a trivial event compared to the big world war that followed. That's the sort of thing I can't predict. I can predict the hyperinflation. I can't predict the world war. I can only live in fear that at some point, some more efficient Donald Trump will eventually arise to take advantage of popular discontent. And that's when things really go bad. The pandemic may have been an unpredictable black swan, at least in its specific appearance, but in general, you can predict that black swans will happen. They always have. You think you have things all worked out, and then some bolt of lightning hits you out of the blue. The effect of these black swans is usually to accelerate destructive processes that were already in play. Government debt, for example, was already a crisis before the pandemic, and now it's many times worse. A few months or years from now, there's sure to be another black swan, and another, and another. Although I don't know what each one of those things will be, you know that they will happen, and they will accelerate unsustainabilities that were already underway. Once I knew that a pandemic was brewing in China, little about how it unfolded really surprised me. In early 2020, I remember telling my elderly father that he might not be seeing me for a while because his retirement village would be locked down. And that's exactly what happened about a month later. It was easy to predict the lockdowns and that they would be draconian and indiscriminate because government response to any crisis is usually pretty ham-handed. You can hear my own real-time reaction to the pandemic in the podcast episodes that I recorded in those early days, starting back on February 3rd, 2020, which was pretty early in the game. I think I was pretty accurate in predicting the worldwide scope of the pandemic and its devastating economic effects. There were three areas, however, where I was way off the mark. My first failure is that I would never in a million years have predicted that the pandemic would result in a rise in stocks and other asset markets. On the contrary, I predicted a devastating crash, which I thought was primed to happen long before the pandemic. It started to happen in March 2020, but then markets reversed course, surged to all-time highs, and that's where they stay today. This was a complete disconnect from the real economy, which is still on life support. The second thing I would have never predicted were race riots in the midst of a pandemic. Some cities like Kenosha, Wisconsin were utterly devastated. You can point to certain precipitating events, certain instances of police brutality, for example, but this is nothing new. Racial discrimination is nothing new. So why were these violent protests happening now? Especially when in any gathering in big groups where you're breathing other people's air is potentially deadly. And a third thing I never would have predicted were labor shortages in the midst of an unemployment crisis. If you drive down any commercial street in America right now, you see big help wanted signs everywhere. And the wages being offered are going up, up, up. This labor shortage is a significant burden to businesses that are just trying to open up right now. Now they can open, but they've got no staff. Now, in retrospect, I now have explanations for each of those three anomalies. I could record a whole podcast on each one of them. The point is, I never would have predicted these three events before they happened, because neither demographics nor macroeconomics give me adequate tools to do so. No science can predict human behavior or the exact unfolding of human events. It's just too complex, and there are too many wildcards. In Weimar Germany, you knew that social tensions were high and that they were destined to be expressed in some way, but you couldn't have predicted Hitler. Just like you couldn't have predicted in 2015 that Donald Trump would be president in 2017. The best that demographics and macroeconomics can do is predict the future of the whole package that we're traveling in, like the trajectory of our whole spacecraft. As an analogy, imagine all of the things that could happen on Earth in the next 50 years. It's silly to try to predict world events in 2071 because there are so many factors involved. Yet astronomers can tell you exactly where in space our planet will be in 2021. It's pure mathematics and it's completely predictable. Demographics and macroeconomics can place the same kind of boundaries on our predictions, even if they can't predict specific events. In particular, they can place an upper limit on how much future economic growth there can be. The last quarter of the 20th century saw astounding economic growth. We were building shopping malls, high-rise towers, new housing developments. Today's demographics can reliably predict that the same growth will never happen again because we just don't have the bodies for it. Macroeconomics can safely predict that tax revenue will never significantly grow, even though government debts have gone through the roof, and that means that one way or another, government debt will fail. It's fair to say that most national governments will never again be solvent. They can only keep printing money until something catastrophic happens to make them stop. The only thing demographics and macroeconomics can do is place a hard ceiling on long-term economic growth. and therefore on the sustainability of asset values and the payability of debt. Below that ceiling, anything is possible.